The crimson sands of Xerion Prime stretched endlessly under twin suns, creating a hellscape that would kill most species within hours. Yet the Draconis had called this world home for thousands of years, their scaled hides and internal cooling systems perfectly adapted to the brutal heat. Young Zephyr pressed his small claws against the observation window of the underground colony, watching the heat waves dance across the desert surface. His sister Lyra found him there, as she always did when their water rations were announced. Today's news was worse than usual. The ancient aquifers that had sustained their people were finally running dry, and the colony's recycling systems couldn't keep up with demand. Elder Thane's voice echoed through the tunnels, explaining in careful words what everyone already knew. They were dying of thirst. Zephyr's bright amber eyes turned to his sister, who was only 3 cycles older, but carried herself with the weight of someone much more mature. Their parents had been lost in a mining accident 2 seasons ago, leaving Lyra to care for her younger brother. She had given him most of her water rations for weeks, though she tried to hide her own suffering. The young dragon's throat felt like sandpaper as he spoke. His voice came out as barely a whisper, cracked and dry. He told Lyra about the dreams he'd been having, dreams of clear blue water falling from the sky, of rivers that never ended. She knew these weren't just dreams but genetic memories passed down from their ancestors who had lived on a world with abundant water before the Great Migration. Outside their small dwelling, other families were making impossible choices. Some of the elders spoke quietly of the honor of sacrifice, of choosing death so the young might live a few more days. The colony's children had stopped playing their usual games, instead sitting quietly in the shadows, their energy sapped by dehydration and hunger. Lyra's mind raced as she held her brother's small hand. She had heard whispers among the adults about the human outpost 3 days' journey across the desert. The humans had arrived on Xerion Prime only months ago, setting up what they called a research station. Most Draconis viewed them with suspicion and fear. These pale, soft creatures seemed impossibly fragile, yet they had somehow crossed the vast emptiness between stars. The colony's leaders had debated making contact with the humans, but pride and fear held them back. What could such weak beings offer to the mighty Draconis? Their ships were smaller than Draconis vessels. Their bodies required constant protection from the environment that the dragons called home. Surely they would laugh at any request for help, or worse, see it as an opportunity to exploit a desperate people. But as Lyra watched her brother's breathing become more labored, as she saw the way his scales had lost their usual luster, desperation began to override pride. She had overheard Communications Officer Crix mentioning that the human base seemed to have some kind of atmospheric processors, machines that pulled moisture from the air. If the humans could extract water from Xerion's bone-dry atmosphere, they might be willing to share. That night, as Zephyr slept fitfully beside her, Lyra made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't watch her brother die, couldn't stand by while their entire colony withered away. The human outpost represented their only hope, no matter how slim or dangerous that hope might be. She began planning her journey, knowing it would likely be a one-way trip. The desert between their colony and the human base was treacherous even for a healthy adult Draconis. For someone already weakened by dehydration, it would be nearly impossible. But the alternative was watching Zephyr fade away, and that was something she refused to accept. As the first sun began to rise, painting the tunnel walls with orange light, Lyra started gathering supplies for her desperate mission. She had no idea if the humans would help, if they would even be able to communicate with her, or if she would survive the journey. All she knew was that her brother needed water, and she would risk everything to get it for him. Lyra slipped through the colony's lower tunnels before dawn, avoiding the main passages where the night guards might spot her. She had left a message crystal for Zephyr, explaining where she had gone and promising to return with help. The small pack on her back contained her remaining water rations, some protein bars made from processed insects, and a basic navigation device that would guide her toward the human outpost. The emergency airlock hissed as she cycled through, and suddenly she was standing on the surface of Xerion Prime as the twin suns crested the horizon. The heat hit her like a physical blow, even through her natural resistances. She had never been outside the colony for more than a few hours, and the vast emptiness of the desert was both beautiful and terrifying. Her clawed feet found purchase on the rocky ground as she began walking toward the coordinates she had memorized. The human outpost lay beyond a series of mesas and crystal formations that jutted from the desert floor like ancient monuments. According to the colony's limited intel, the journey would take 3 days if she maintained a steady pace and didn't encounter any sandstorms. By midday, Lyra was already feeling the strain. Her body's natural cooling systems were working overtime, using precious water reserves to keep her core temperature stable. She rationed herself to tiny sips from her water container, knowing she had to make it last. The landscape around her was a maze of red rock and shifting sand, with no landmarks except the distant peaks that marked her destination. As the hours passed, she began to understand why so few Draconis ever attempted long desert crossings. The heat created mirages that made navigation difficult, and the shifting sands could hide dangerous crevasses or unstable ground. Twice she had to backtrack when her path was blocked by impossible terrain. During the hottest part of the day, she found shelter in a small cave and tried to rest. Her thoughts kept returning to Zephyr, wondering if he was getting worse, if the colony's situation had deteriorated further. She pulled out a small communication device and tried to reach the colony, but the distance and interference from the mineral deposits in the rock made contact impossible. That evening, as the temperature finally began to drop from unbearable to merely oppressive, she resumed her journey. The night brought its own challenges as the darkness made it hard to navigate safely, but it also brought relief from the crushing heat, allowing her to make better time across the desert floor. She had been walking for nearly 18 hours when she saw them in the distance, lights that didn't belong to any natural phenomenon on Xerion Prime. The human outpost appeared as a cluster of dome-shaped structures connected by enclosed walkways, all glowing with artificial illumination against the star-filled sky. As she drew closer, Lyra could see that the humans had indeed accomplished something remarkable. Their base was surrounded by what looked like atmospheric processors, tall towers with spinning collectors that seemed to be pulling moisture from the air. Gardens of some kind of vegetation grew under protective domes, and she could actually smell water in the air around the facility. But her relief was tempered by fear as she realized she had no plan for actually making contact. The humans might see her as a threat, or they might not be able to understand her at all. Their species had only recently made contact, and communication protocols were still being developed by the colony's leadership. Security sensors had likely already detected her approach, and she could see movement within the base as figures moved between the structures. Lyra settled behind a large boulder about a kilometer from the outpost's perimeter, trying to gather her courage for what might be the most important conversation in Draconis history. Her throat was parched, her scales dry and cracked from the journey, but she had made it. Now came the hardest part, convincing these strange alien beings to help save her brother and her people. Dr. Sarah Chen was reviewing atmospheric data in the main laboratory when the proximity alarms began sounding throughout the outpost. Her coffee mug rattled against the metal desk as she pulled up the security feeds, expecting to see another dust storm approaching. Instead, she found herself staring at something that made her heart race with excitement and fear. A single Draconis stood motionless near the perimeter, partially hidden behind an outcropping of crystalline rock. The creature was smaller than the adult specimens they had observed from a distance, with scales that gleamed deep purple even in the infrared imaging. Most remarkably, it appeared to be alone and unarmed, which went against everything their xenobiology team had learned about Draconis behavior patterns. Base Commander Rodriguez joined her at the monitor, his expression grim. The standing orders from Earth were clear about maintaining minimal contact with the indigenous population until proper protocols could be established. But those same orders had been written by people who had never seen a Draconis up close, who didn't understand the intelligence that burned behind those amber eyes. Sarah enhanced the image and noticed details that made her breath catch. The Draconis showed clear signs of severe dehydration, dulled scales, labored breathing, and the way it moved with careful conserved energy. This wasn't a warrior or scout conducting surveillance. This was someone desperate enough to risk everything for a chance at survival. The outpost's linguist, Dr. Patel, was hastily assembling a translation matrix based on the limited Draconis language samples they had collected from intercepted communications. The species used a complex system of vocalizations, body language, and even controlled chemical emissions to communicate. Human vocal cords could only approximate a fraction of their speech patterns. As the team debated their options, The Draconis made the decision for them. It stood up from behind the rocks and began walking slowly toward the main gate, its clawed hands held clearly away from its body, in what appeared to be a universal gesture of peaceful intent. Each step seemed to cost tremendous effort, and Sarah realized they were watching someone at the absolute limit of their endurance. Commander Rodriguez authorized the deployment of their contact protocol, something they had practiced but never used. A small team would approach the perimeter with portable translation equipment while maintaining safe distance. Sarah volunteered immediately, her xenobiology expertise making her the logical choice despite the obvious risks. The airlock cycled with a hiss, and Sarah found herself outside the protective barriers of the outpost for only the second time since arriving on Xerion Prime. The heat was crushing even through her environmental suit, and she couldn't imagine how the Draconis survived in this environment naturally. She carried a container of purified water and basic medical supplies, hoping that universal gestures of aid might bridge the communication gap. As she approached the gate, the Draconis stopped walking and slowly lowered itself to the ground, sitting in a position that seemed to indicate submission or supplication. When Sarah was close enough to see the creature's face clearly, she was struck by the intelligence and desperation in those alien eyes. This was someone's child, someone's family member, and they were dying. The translation device crackled to life as the Draconis began to speak, its voice a mixture of musical tones and harsh consonants that the machine struggled to interpret. Fragments of meaning came through the static. Water, brother, colony, dying. The universal translator was primitive, but the message was becoming clear. Sarah set down the water container and pushed it toward the Draconis, who looked at it with a mixture of hope and confusion. The young dragon's hand trembled as it reached for the offering, and Sarah watched in amazement as the creature carefully opened the container and took only a small sip before securing it again. Even in desperate need, it was rationing the precious liquid. The Draconis tried again to communicate, this time using gestures along with words. It pointed toward itself, then toward the desert, then made motions that suggested a smaller figure. It was becoming clear that this brave individual had crossed the deadly wasteland not for personal salvation, but to save someone else. Sarah spoke slowly into her translator, hoping the machine could convey her meaning. She offered help, asked about the nature of the emergency, and tried to express that the humans were not enemies. The conversation was halting and frustrating, but gradually a picture emerged of a dying colony and a young dragon who had risked everything to save his sister. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a first contact situation anymore. This was a humanitarian crisis that could define the relationship between their species for generations to come. Inside the Outpost main conference room, the debate was intense. Commander Rodriguez paced behind the central table while the senior staff argued over protocols, regulations, and the potential consequences of their next actions. The Draconis, who had identified herself as Lyra through the struggling translation software, waited in the medical bay where Dr. Martinez was treating her severe dehydration. Dr. Chen presented the situation with clinical precision, but her voice carried emotional weight that couldn't be ignored. The Draconis colony was facing extinction within days. Their water recycling systems had failed and their natural sources were completely depleted. Lyra had described watching children and elders slowly dying, while the colony's leaders debated solutions that didn't exist. The outpost's chief engineer, Thompson, was already running calculations on their atmospheric processors. The machines could theoretically produce enough water to sustain the Draconis colony, but it would require significant modifications and a massive increase in power consumption. More importantly, it would mean revealing the full extent of human technological capabilities to an alien species they barely understood. Political officer Nakamura raised the concerns that everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to voice. Earth's colonial administration had strict guidelines about interfering with indigenous populations. Providing aid could be seen as creating dependence, or worse, could be interpreted as an act of cultural imperialism. The legal ramifications alone could end all their careers. But Dr. Patel, the linguist who had been working with Lyra, brought news that changed everything. Through careful translation work, he had learned that Lyra wasn't just asking for help for her colony. She was specifically pleading for her younger brother Zephyr, who was among the weakest and most vulnerable of the colonists. She had crossed the desert knowing she might die, all to save one small dragon who trusted her completely. Commander Rodriguez found himself thinking about his own daughter back on Earth, about the lengths parents and siblings would go to protect their children. The regulations and protocols suddenly seemed less important than the image of a dying child calling out for water while his sister risked everything to answer that call. The decision was made with surprising unanimity once the human factor was considered. They would provide emergency aid to the Draconis colony. Consequences be damned. Thompson immediately began modifying the atmospheric processors to increase output, while Dr. Martinez prepared medical supplies that might help the most severely dehydrated colonists. Lyra's reaction to the news was deeply moving to everyone present. Through the translation device, she expressed gratitude that seemed to encompass not just personal relief but genuine surprise that aliens would help her people. It became clear that the Draconis had expected humans to be either hostile or indifferent to their suffering. The logistics of the rescue mission were complex. The Outpost's cargo transport could carry enough water and medical supplies to save the colony. But the journey would be dangerous for the human crew. Zerion Prime's atmosphere was corrosive to their equipment, and the heat could be fatal even with environmental suits if anything went wrong. Lyra insisted on guiding them back to the colony, despite her weakened condition. She knew the safest routes through the desert and could help with navigation around the various hazards. More importantly, her presence would help convince the colony's leaders that the humans were truly offering aid, rather than attempting some kind of invasion or trick. As the rescue team prepared for departure, Dr. Chen found herself studying Lyra with fascination and respect. This young Draconis had accomplished something remarkable. She had forced two alien species to see past their fears and differences to recognize their shared values. The idea that family bonds and the protection of children were universal concepts had profound implications for future relations between their peoples. The cargo transport was loaded with enough purified water to sustain the entire colony for weeks, along with portable atmospheric processors that could provide a long-term solution. Medical supplies designed for extreme dehydration were packed, alongside communication equipment that would allow the two species to maintain contact and coordinate ongoing aid efforts. As they lifted off from the outpost, Lyra pressed her face to the small porthole window, her amber eyes fixed on the horizon where her brother waited. The journey that had taken her nearly 2 days on foot would take less than 4 hours by air, but every minute felt like an eternity when she thought about Zephyr growing weaker with each passing moment. The Draconis colony appeared as a series of barely visible openings in the cliff face, so well camouflaged that the human transport crew might have flown right past without Lyra's guidance. As they descended toward the designated landing area, the magnitude of the crisis became apparent through the thermal imaging sensors. The underground chambers showed dozens of heat signatures that were far cooler than they should be for healthy Draconis physiology. Elder Thane emerged from the main entrance as the human transport touched down, his massive frame moving with the careful deliberation of someone conserving every ounce of energy. Behind him came a small group of colony leaders, their scales dulled by dehydration, but their postures radiating suspicion and desperate hope in equal measure. Lyra was the first to exit the transport, and the reaction from her people was immediate and emotional. Several younger Draconis rushed forward to embrace her, their relief at her safe return obvious despite the language barrier. But Lyra's attention was focused entirely on finding her brother, and she disappeared into the tunnel system with Dr. Martinez close behind, carrying emergency medical supplies. Dr. Chen and Commander Rodriguez approached Elder Thane with careful protocol, using the translation device to explain their peaceful intentions and their desire to provide humanitarian aid. The old dragon listened with the patience of someone who had lived through countless crises, but his amber eyes never left the cases of water being unloaded from the transport. The scene inside the colony was heartbreaking. The humans had seen the thermal readings, but witnessing the reality was something entirely different. Draconis families sat quietly in the cooler lower chambers, adults using their own bodies to shade the youngest children from even the dim, artificial lighting. The air recycling systems hummed constantly, trying to maintain breathable atmosphere while conserving every molecule of moisture. Lyra found Zephyr in their small family chamber, curled up on his sleeping platform with barely enough energy to lift his head when she entered. The young dragon's condition had deteriorated significantly during her absence, and Dr. Martinez immediately began administering carefully measured amounts of electrolyte solution while monitoring his vital signs. The distribution of water throughout the colony became a study in Draconis social structure and human efficiency. Elder Thane and the colony leaders had established strict protocols for rationing that prioritized the youngest and oldest first, with healthy adults receiving minimal amounts. The humans were impressed by the orderly way the colonists lined up, despite their obvious desperation. Dr. Chen worked alongside the colony's medical officer, an elderly female named Healer Cetus, to identify the most critical cases. The language barrier made diagnosis challenging, but medical need was universal enough that they could work together effectively. Several of the oldest colonists had slipped into comas from severe dehydration, while many of the children showed signs of organ stress that required immediate intervention. Word spread through the colony that the humans had brought not just emergency water but also the technology to provide a long-term solution. The atmosphere began to change. The quiet despair that had settled over the underground chambers was replaced by cautious optimism and a growing sense of wonder at these strange aliens who had risked their own safety to help. The installation of the portable atmospheric processors required careful engineering work in the colony's upper chambers. Thompson and his team had to modify the systems to work with Draconis power sources, while ensuring they wouldn't interfere with the existing life support infrastructure. The work was complicated by the heat and the need to wear full environmental suits, but the human engineers pressed on with determination. Young Zephyr's recovery became a symbol of hope for the entire colony. As the medical treatment and careful rehydration took effect, his natural curiosity began to reassert itself. He was fascinated by the humans, especially Dr. Martinez, whose gentle bedside manner transcended species barriers. Through Lyra's translation, he asked endless questions about Earth, human families, and whether all humans were as kind as the ones who had saved his people. By the end of the first day, the immediate crisis had passed. The atmospheric processors were functioning perfectly, pulling moisture from Xerion Prime's dry air and converting it into pure, drinkable water. The colony's storage tanks were filling for the first time in months, and the sound of flowing water had returned to the underground chambers. Elder Thane approached Commander Rodriguez as the human team prepared for their return journey. Through the translation device, he expressed gratitude that went far beyond simple thanks for material aid. He spoke of debts that could never be repaid, of friendship forged in the crucible of desperate need, and of a future where the two species might stand together as allies rather than strangers. 3 weeks after the rescue mission, the relationship between the human outpost and the Draconis colony had evolved into something unprecedented in interstellar relations. Daily communication exchanges had been established, with both Dr. Patel and several Draconis linguists working together to develop a more sophisticated translation protocol. The breakthrough came when they realized that Draconis language included emotional and chemical components that could be approximated through visual displays and synthesized pheromones. Zephyr had become an unofficial ambassador between the species, his natural curiosity and rapid recovery making him a favorite among the human researchers. Through video communications, he had formed a particular friendship with Dr. Chen's daughter Emma back on Earth. Despite the significant communication delays, the young dragon was fascinated by stories of Earth's oceans and forests, while Emma was amazed by descriptions of life in underground cities beneath twin suns. The atmospheric processors had not only solved the immediate water crisis, but had revealed the true potential of human-Draconis cooperation. The Draconis possessed geological knowledge of Xerion Prime that allowed the humans to locate mineral deposits that had eluded their surveys. In return, human technology was helping the colony expand their living spaces and improve their quality of life in ways they had never imagined possible. Commander Rodriguez found himself dealing with increasingly complex questions from Earth's colonial administration. What had begun as an emergency humanitarian mission was rapidly becoming a permanent alliance, and the bureaucrats back home were struggling to develop policies for a situation that had never been anticipated. The regulations simply hadn't been written for scenarios where aliens turned out to be people with families, hopes, and children who needed saving. Lyra had emerged as a key figure in the growing cooperation between the species. Her courage in making the desperate journey to the human outpost had earned her tremendous respect among her own people, while her intelligence and diplomatic instincts made her a natural liaison with the humans. She was learning English with remarkable speed, while teaching several humans the basics of Draconis communication. The colony itself was transforming as the water crisis receded into memory. Children who had been listless and weak were now playing in the tunnels again, their laughter echoing through chambers that had been silent for too long. The elders were making plans for expansion and growth, something that would have been impossible just a month earlier. Gardens were being established in some of the upper chambers, using human hydroponic technology adapted for Draconis crops. Dr. Martinez had become deeply involved in Draconis medicine, working with healer scientists to understand their physiology and develop better treatment protocols for future emergencies. The collaboration had already led to several breakthrough discoveries about desert adaptation that could prove valuable for human colonization efforts on other arid worlds, but perhaps the most significant development was the growing friendship between individual humans and Draconis. Thompson had been teaching several young dragons about engineering principles, while Dr. Patel was documenting Draconis cultural traditions and oral histories. These personal connections were creating bonds that went far beyond formal diplomatic relations. The transformation was perhaps most evident in Zephyr himself. The weak, dehydrated child who had nearly died was now a healthy, energetic young dragon, with dreams of visiting Earth someday. He had started learning to write in English, sending carefully composed messages to Emma and the other humans who had saved his life. His artwork, painted on cave walls with mineral pigments, depicted humans and Draconis standing together under the stars. Elder Thane had officially requested that Earth establish a permanent diplomatic mission in the colony, while offering Draconis expertise to help with human expansion efforts throughout the system. The mineral wealth of Xerion Prime was vast, and Draconis mining techniques had been refined over thousands of years. In exchange, human technology could help the Draconis explore other worlds and perhaps find one with the abundant water their genetic memories still craved. As Lyra stood in the main chamber watching, human and Draconis children play together. Despite their obvious biological differences, she reflected on how much had changed since that desperate night when she had decided to cross the desert. Her brother was not just alive but thriving. Her people had hope for the future, and two species had discovered that the universe was a little less lonely than they had thought. The message she had sent to the human outpost that morning was simple but profound. An invitation for Dr. Chen and her team to attend a ceremony the colony was planning to honor the humans who had risked everything to save them. It would be the first formal cultural exchange between their species, but Lyra suspected it would not be the last. 6 months later, the ceremony hall in the expanded Draconis colony was unlike anything that had existed before on Xerion Prime. Human engineering and Draconis artistry had combined to create a space that accommodated both species comfortably, with climate controls that maintained optimal temperature zones and atmospheric processors that ensured perfect air quality. The walls were decorated with murals depicting the rescue mission, painted by both human and Draconis artists working together. Zephyr stood at the center of the hall, no longer the dying child who had once cried out for water in the darkness. He had grown significantly in the months since the rescue, his scales now gleaming with health and his amber eyes bright with intelligence and curiosity. Today he would formally present the colony's gift to their human friends. A water sculpture created using techniques passed down through generations of Draconis artists. The sculpture itself was a marvel of engineering and artistry. Using the abundant water now available through the atmospheric processors, Draconis craftsmen had created flowing patterns that captured light and movement in ways that defied human understanding of physics. The water seemed to flow upward in impossible spirals, creating music as it moved through carefully designed chambers and passages. Dr. Chen sat in the place of honor beside Elder Thane, wearing ceremonial robes that had been specially crafted by Draconis artisans. The fabric incorporated human synthetic materials with traditional Draconis designs, creating something that belonged fully to neither culture and completely to both. She had become the unofficial human ambassador to the colony, spending more time in the underground chambers than at the outpost. Commander Rodriguez watched from the diplomatic section as Lyra approached the podium. She had been elected to the colony's leadership council, making her one of the youngest dragons ever to hold such a position. Her speech would be delivered in both languages, using the sophisticated translation system that had been developed through months of cooperative work between human and Draconis linguists. The ceremony began with traditional Draconis throat singing, a haunting melody that resonated through the stone chambers with otherworldly beauty. The humans had learned to appreciate this art form, even attempting to participate despite their limited vocal range. In return, the Draconis had become fascinated with human music, particularly the concept of harmony and the use of instrumental accompaniment. Lyra's speech was a masterpiece of diplomacy and emotion. She spoke of the night when her brother had called out for water, of her desperate journey across the desert, and of the moment when she first saw the lights of the human outpost. But more than that, she spoke of the future that had opened up before both their peoples, of the children who would grow up knowing that the universe contained friends as well as strangers. The formal presentation of the water sculpture was accompanied by the unveiling of the human gift, a holographic projection system that could display images of Earth's oceans, forests, and weather systems. For a people who had lived their entire lives in underground chambers, the sight of rain falling on green meadows was nothing short of miraculous. Several of the older dragons wept openly as they watched recordings of Earth's great rivers, their genetic memories finally seeing the paradise their ancestors had left behind. But the most moving moment came when Zephyr stepped forward to speak. His English had improved dramatically over the months, and he delivered his remarks without translation assistance. He thanked the humans not just for saving his life, but for showing his people that cooperation was possible between species that seemed impossibly different. He spoke of his dreams of visiting Earth someday, of seeing the oceans that featured in so many human stories. The ceremony concluded with the signing of the Xerion Accords, a formal treaty between Earth's colonial administration and the Draconis Collective. The agreement established permanent diplomatic relations, outlined protocols for trade and cultural exchange, and created a joint research initiative to explore other worlds in the system. More importantly, it recognized both species as equals in their shared quest to understand the universe and their place within it. As the celebration continued into the night, with humans and Draconis sharing food, music, and stories, Dr. Chen found herself talking with Zephyr about his plans for the future. The young dragon had been accepted into a joint education program that would allow him to study on Earth while maintaining his connections to his home colony. He would be among the first Draconis to walk beneath alien skies. Just as the humans had been the first of their species to breathe Xerion's desert air, the water sculpture continued to flow and sing in the center of the hall, its impossible patterns catching the light and casting dancing shadows on the walls. It had become a symbol of what was possible when different peoples chose cooperation over fear, when the cry of a child for water could bridge the gap between worlds and species. Outside the colony, the twin suns of Xerion Prime sat behind the desert mesas, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The atmospheric processors hummed quietly, pulling moisture from the air and ensuring that no Draconis child would ever again cry out for water in vain. And in the growing darkness between the stars, other species watched and wondered if they too might find friendship among the vast loneliness of space.